Hmm.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, Ask a Funeral Director, with thanatologist Matilda Garrido and special guest Amy Cunningham. My name is Emily Hill-Wright, and I am the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum, New York City's only family home to be preserved intact both inside and out from the 19th century. Home to the Treadwell family and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years, the Merchants House is complete with the family's original furnishings and personal possessions. The house offers, with unparalleled authenticity, an intimate look at life in mid-19th century New York. As many of you know, for the last 12 years, the Merchants House has been fighting proposed development next door, construction that is guaranteed to cause irreparable damage to our landmark building and will force us to close the museum to the public for at least 2 years. Last December, in a shocking betrayal, the Landmarks Preservation Commission voted to approve the development, in spite of overwhelming and unanimous opposition from the community, preservation organizations, public officials, engineers, and preservation architects. This disastrous vote is a warning to every other landmark in New York City. If this can happen to the Merchants House, the very first building in Manhattan designated a New York City landmark in 1965, then every landmark in New York is at risk. We have just launched a letter writing campaign urging the Adams administration and its buildings department to step in to protect the Merchants House, a city-owned interior and exterior landmark and a beloved and irreplaceable educational and community resource. Please take just 30 seconds to sign your name and submit a letter. I am posting the direct link here in the chat right now. If you click it right now, you'll be able to submit your letter before I even finish talking. And yes, you can submit a letter even if you don't live in New York. Tourism, as you know, is an economic engine in the city, and it is important that the administration hears from supporters from all over. Thank you. Before we begin, during tonight's program, please do feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. And I am just delighted tonight to welcome Matilda Garrido. Matilda is a certified thanatologist and holds dual master's degrees in bioethics and thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement. She has worked extensively with the dying and bereaved. She volunteers at the Merchants House in various capacities, including as co-host of our monthly paranormal video podcast, In the Spirit of Science, and as the host of Ask a new virtual program series that we are, of course, kicking off this evening. So welcome, Matilda. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. And Amy, thank you so much for being here. And while Emily was talking, I remembered that I first met you at the Merchants House. I met you back in 2018 when they showed the film about home funerals. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
I was
that was a
just
beautiful night.
getting into the field. I had just started my my master's degree, and I went to this program, and you were there, and we got to talking, and then we kept in touch, and it's just been such a pleasure to know and work with you. So, and I'm so grateful that you're with us tonight.
Wow, thank you so much. Yes, the friendship is deepening as we move on with this work.
Yeah. So I know everyone will want to know what led you to funeral service. What made you want to become a funeral director?
I was a 55-year-old blogger and magazine journalist in 2009 when my father died in the care of hospice down in South Carolina. I had 2 boys in high school. I was happily married. I became quite fascinated with the life of the hospice volunteers and nurses and doctors. And I was awakened to how beautiful and poignant and, of course, terribly sad all simultaneously the last weeks, days, and hours of a of a person's life can be. And my father was so courageous in the face of all that and had the death he pretty much wanted to have,
Mm.
that he had planned his funeral also, and wanted a simple cremation with a large memorial event in the Presbyterian church down there. And it was music infused and such a powerful afternoon for me, and a healing experience with my siblings. And I came out of that memorial event. There was nothing green about it. There was nothing based in Victorian custom and everything we're going to talk about tonight. It was just a memorial event in a church, but it went so well and it represented Dad's values that I came back to Brooklyn and said to my husband in the kitchen soon after, my God, Dad is dead. I can't believe it. But I'm so sad. But that experience we had down there as a family was so incredibly powerful. And I'm proud of what we built. I wonder what it would be like to be a funeral director. I was interested in contemplative practice. I'd written about cloistered nuns and Buddhist meditation, and my husband had launched a website about religion and spirituality in America, and we had a good understanding of the religious landscape today, with folks intermarrying and mixing it up. And our own household is a Jewish Protestant amalgam of customs and loving traditions, and we raised the boys real well within that context and understood that other Americans were having similar sorts of holidays. And so with that understanding of ritual, I felt particularly well equipped to move into funerals.
Yeah.
And I think I was a little naive. I thought funeral school would be about the history of funeral service
Right.
and grief counseling. And I had no way of understanding until I got there that it was a lot of embalming, a lot of chemistry, and a lot of business. So I got through all that and got my license after a residency. And now I have my own little business in New York City, and I specialize in earth-friendly burials, cremations at Greenwood Cemetery, and home funerals.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a way, you were sort of symbolic of a change that was going on in the funeral industry at the time that you went back to school, with more women becoming involved. And I think I've read that the largest percentage of incoming classes at mortuary school are young women.
Yes.
We're just seeing such a return, a desire to not shut death away anymore and to really tend to the dying. I'm not sure if it's because we see death all the time with the advent of 24-hour news, and we feel so helpless and we feel like we want to do something about it, something to help, or what it is. But what's your perspective about why the industry has changed? I mean, I know Jessica Mitford's book, written in the 60s, The American Way of Death, was sort of an expose of the funeral profession. I want to use the phrase that she kind of demonized the funeral profession a little bit. So I know that there's been a movement towards change since then, but it does seem in the last 5 to 7 years that there's been an acceleration of people, as you say, wanting to explore green funerals, home funerals, being more hands-on with the body themselves. What do you think accounts for that sort of shift?
It seems to track and follow women going into law schools, women going into the military, areas that were thought ill-suited for women in the past are now obviously incredible careers and a wonderful choice for a woman. And I love my male colleagues and I've learned a lot from them, but the women coming in have sort of a holistic approach. Perhaps, I don't know if, they're their mothers. Some of them are older. All of them are so sensitive and have had their own losses that they want to continue to process and help other people learn what they've learned. So it's exciting, and it
Yeah.
is really changing things and putting
Mm-hmm.
a much gentler approach to the orchestration of the average American funeral today.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, the rates of embalming have gone down. The industry is, well, they've gone down for a number of reasons. First of all, people are exploring alternate forms of disposal, like cremation and things like that. There also are environmental concerns around the use of fluids and workplace conditions and things like that. But the industry is actively looking for more earth-friendly embalming materials. I I I I have my own perspective on embalming is, you know, because I do so much work in hospice and people at the end of life, and I have seen so many people so very ravaged by illness, and have also seen the benefit of restoration for the family having a last view of their person. I am particularly interested in the sort of movement towards earth-friendly embalming fluids. What's your thought on that?
Well, 12 years ago, when I got into the funeral business, I was a little sassy about embalming.
Yeah.
I didn't want to learn it. I felt, and I quite completely changed my tune. Even while I was at mortuary school, my favorite professor was my embalming professor,
Mm.
and I saw that embalmers, the good ones, are artists. And
Yes.
there's lots of good to it. I also, as a resident, I saw
Mm.
families tumbling out of the visitation room and saying, "Please tell me where the embalmer is. I want to hug him." In
Yeah.
the case of that funeral home, there are many female embalmers now too, but at the time I was working in a place that had a male embalmer, and people who had left their loved one in the hospital looking pretty awful, they were just so grateful that she seemed more herself again. So I softened, and
Mm.
as I've aged in this calling, I recognized that embalming really has a role.
Mm.
Plus, during the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, African American doulas and directors began to be more outspoken about, why are you white progressive people in the alternative funeral movement, the green burial movement, chastising us about
Yeah.
embalming?
Mm-hmm.
They began to state the very good argument that our people are often dying of gunshot wounds, and their bodies have been traumatized, and they need the embalmer. And we are so grateful for this practice. Plus, if you really get down to it, embalming is the greatest risk to the worker,
Yeah.
the workers themselves. It's
Mm-hmm.
gas, and you really have to catch um, some of the green burial advocates and people who are looking at other methods that are more natural. All that's very virtuous and great, but formaldehyde really doesn't damage the soil. It's
Okay,
not
that's
a lot.
really interesting because, yeah, I think that it has been presented as one of the arguments against burying embalmed bodies.
Yep, and it's a cancer-causing gas
Mm-hmm.
that's harmful to the respiratory system of the embalmer over the course of a long career. So,
Right, right.
you know, I'm not behind, during the Trump administration, the chemical formaldehyde did very well and was kept being pretty much unregulated. Every time
Mm-hmm.
the Democrats come in, you start getting memos about, watch out, they're coming after our formaldehyde from the National Funeral Directors Association. So you know, we want to protect the workers and get them wearing respirators. That's the safest thing. And keep embalming where it's appropriate and necessary, but also educate people to know embalming is never required by law.
Right.
Don't ever let a funeral director encourage you to embalm when you don't want it and you don't think there's a need for it.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to people have to just become very educated about the options, the benefits and the drawbacks of all of the different options. And, you know, as you know, I spend quite a bit of time encouraging people to actually think about the end of their life and think about their funeral arrangements so that their families don't have to make decisions during that painful time when they don't have really the mental bandwidth. They're just entering into their grieving process, and to make a decision about what to do when someone has never indicated a preference can be extremely painful.
Yes.
So let's talk green funerals, because a lot of people wrote in with questions about that. I also want to let everybody know that there's a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking audience questions at the end, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A.
You caused me, before you go to the questions, you caused me to just recognize that I think one reason people hate talking about, or people pre-pandemic used to hate talking about their funerals and not want to plan them. I think it's because it was felt that, oh my gosh, funeral planning is just about choosing a casket I don't want, talking about embalming, looking at urns that aren't healing to me. There was sort of a divide, and no one was talking to funeral planners about what's your favorite music? What are your values? There are different questions now that we're asking to entice people to see how lovely funeral planning can be, and what a fabulous conversation it is to have at Thanksgiving with your family members. What you want?
I'll do it. Yeah, we like to do it, right? We like to do it. Well, it's so interesting. I don't know if you have seen the movie American Fiction, but there's a scene, you know, when Tracy Ellen Ross's character dies and leaves a letter to be read aloud at her service, and it was really just, I have to get a transcript of that letter and use it as a resource when I work with people. It just was it was great. Yeah, it was great. But so someone comes to you and says, I want to do a green funeral. So how do you move forward with that? What makes a funeral green? What are you talking about with them? What does it look like, you know, when they die, and casketing and burial and all that stuff?
Well, let's see. There's a lot to unpack. We're very excited in New York that natural organic reduction is now lawful, and lawful in 5 or 6 other states. And eventually, 10 years from now, there'll be options available to us that are greener than the options available today. But at this moment, if someone walked into my Brooklyn office and said, I want a green funeral, I would sort of assume they were talking about a burial, because there are right now only 2 options, burial or cremation.
Right.
And the cremations as currently practiced in this country, except for one town in Colorado where they have an open pyre, every other cremation is gas fueled. That means it's fossil fuel to heat that chamber to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit and cremate a human being down to the calcium and mineral salts and phosphorus in their bones.
So this is really interesting. This is a common misconception, I think, that people think cremation means that the body is actually burned, but that's not what it means, right? I mean, it doesn't go into an open flame.
It's a pressurized heat. There's a golden glow to it when they open the chamber. So there are, I think there are some lapping flames, but it's in a chamber and contained. And within a 3-hour period, all the water, you know, our bodies are mostly water, and all the soft tissue comes off that bone and is reduced to a bone fragment that we call ash. So
Mhm.
there's no wood anymore. It's just a gas process.
Got it.
And it's hot in there, but it's not the worst crime you would commit environmentally. And so many, you could never tell anyone who's Hindu that cremation is not eco-friendly or improper
Right.
or anything, because it's so integral to their practice to believe that the soul is liberated and purified by the fire and the flame.
Right.
So
Mhm.
I tread softly here, but the greenest thing right now is for a funeral director to with the family sometimes present, to transfer that deceased person, or I'm getting confused, because you could even either keep the deceased person in their residence and have
Mhm.
a home funeral there and then a green burial, never embalm, use a casket, and show the family a variety of options with caskets that are earth friendly,
Mm.
caskets that are either very simple pine, they're wooden caskets that are pine. That's a soft wood and a wood that releases into the soil
Mm.
rapidly. We also have all kinds of woven caskets today that are bamboo or willow that are really pretty and even harken back to Victorian times.
Mhm.
Back in the days of Merchant's House, people used those willow baskets to transfer deceased people out of the home sometimes
Mm.
to the funeral parlor, where they were then put into a hardwood casket. But there are lots of vessels these days to put a deceased person in that would then go back to the soil. So
Mm.
without embalming, with a natural casket like that, without a burial vault inside the grave, that means a concrete liner that some cemeteries still use to delineate one grave from the next.
Mhm.
A green burial requests that that not be used. All you're doing really is planting the loved one into the earth. And the most radical and marvelous, I think, kind of green burial is not to use a casket at all, and to
Right.
have the deceased person beautifully shrouded in linen fabric or silk.
Mm.
Or I've had families take um, old bathrobes and beautiful textiles and make them into a shroud for their loved
Mm.
one. Old table linens. It's really marvelous what people pull together.
Yeah.
It's like a great burial garment. And we wrap people in that and present them at the cemetery on a board, just a
Mhm.
simple uh, piece of barnwood or a kind of plank of repurposed lumber, and gently lower them into the grave, wrapped in
Mm.
fabric. You don't see their face, they're all wrapped up and surrounded
Right.
by flowers. And there are also willow trays that you can look at online or on my Instagram page. There's beautiful hand woven things today that are very green and go back to the earth rather quickly.
Mm.
So the main definition of, in answer to your real question, what is a green burial? It's a manner, it's a mode of disposition that surrenders the body to the soil without any impediment to decomposition. You want the body to just dissolve in the ground in the
Okay.
old-fashioned way, the way it's a prairie burial. It's as basic as a burial can be.
Yeah. So there are green burial grounds that are entirely green burial. And my understanding is that many of those do not allow markers or headstones because they want to preserve the landscape. But it's becoming increasingly possible to do a green burial in a traditional cemetery, right? Are cemeteries setting aside specific spaces for that?
Yep, cemeteries like Greenwood, or here in
Mhm.
Brooklyn, the Evergreens, uh, a woodlawn in
Mhm.
the Bronx will accept a deceased person wrapped in fabric and allow upright markers because they
Okay.
don't have the same. That's called a hybrid.
Sure.
A traditional cemetery that's allowing a green burial.
Okay.
And
So
in
that's a
fact,
nice option.
welcoming it. Yeah, they welcome
Yeah,
it.
that's a nice option for people who feel strongly about having a marker or something like that.
I one time spoke to a group of gravestone studies people, and
Mm,
they loved green burial until I got down to the marker. They were like,
yeah.
uh-oh, nope, I want an upright marker. And I agree that those are very beautiful and nice.
Yeah, yeah.
But the
So
flat
not,
stones, Matilda, the flat stones in some natural burial spots are also awesome because they're boulders and the engraver
mm,
comes to the cemetery and graves by hand.
oh,
And
that's beautiful.
while they're flat to the ground, they're impressive
Hmm.
and nice looking. So another thing to consider.
Yeah. And in the New York area, what are our closest green burial grounds? Not in a traditional cemetery.
I've planted a lot of New Yorkers about 3 miles outside New Paltz, the college town
Okay.
of New Paltz. There's a cemetery called Rosendale Plains Cemetery, which is one of the least expensive cemeteries in the state of New York.
Okay.
Like $1,000 for a plot and $1,000 to open that plot. And it's lovely and rural and just 2 hours and 15 minutes outside Brooklyn, closer to the Upper West Side, of course. That's one. Rhinebeck has a lovely town cemetery where you can bury in the woods in a
Mm,
natural manner. The most famous conservation ground is 15 miles south of Ithaca, and that's
okay.
called Green Springs. And I have a whole list on my website of great places. Sleepy Hollow, Victoria,
Mm,
like Greenwood, Sleepy Hollow is a great cemetery and has for a long time been a leader in the green burial movement.
okay. And green burials overall, I'm guessing, are less expensive than a more traditional burial because you're not paying for the vault. Chances are you're using a much simpler casket. I mean, I know some of the reed and willow caskets can run into the thousands if you want to go very top of the line. But, if you're not paying for the vault, if you're not paying for an expensive casket, it's
Mhm.
generally less expensive too.
And especially if you're driving upstate, the
Hmm.
further you get outside the 5 boroughs of New York, or those of you joining us from other cities, the further you get out of an urban area, the less expensive that cemetery land is going to be.
Okay. What about home funerals? Not every green funeral is a home funeral, and not every home funeral is a green funeral, right? But like green funerals, home funerals are becoming increasingly popular.
Yes, and I'm seeing sort of a middle way emerging, and that's the delayed transfer.
Mm,
Family that may not want to put their loved one on dry ice for 3 days in the Buddhist custom,
hmm.
but they may want a good 12 or 18 hours. Maybe one of the siblings is in San Francisco and quickly flying into New York, or maybe they just want to hang out a little bit because, and these are cases, by the way, Matilda, where hospice is presiding. When
Mm-hmm.
when hospice is presiding, when it's an expected death of an elderly person, someone who's had cancer, and when that death is seen as coming soon, and hospice is called in, those are optimal circumstances for a home-based uh, ritual or a delayed transfer. So by
Mm-hmm.
delayed transfer, I get phone calls and I train people. I say, okay, now when it happens, when she dies, if it's 3 in the morning, I still want you to wake me up, but we don't have to come there until whenever you want. So sometimes I will get a call at 6. Mom's dead. We're just sitting here crying. We wanted you to know, but we moved the oxygen machine out of the room. We've lit some candles. We're going to have a little vigil here. And could you come get her, in 6 or 7 hours?
Right.
So that kind of delayed transfer is a bit of a home funeral and a really nice compromise for families who don't want the big thing. But in Victorian
Oh,
style, some families are wanting to definitely spend a day, 2 days,
mm-hmm.
sometimes 3, uh, with their loved one in place in the bed they died in, or sometimes I bring in a massage table and beautiful linens, and we put, or I have even brought in caskets lightweight, nimble caskets that come in through the door that we set up in the living room of the home or in the apartment, and put the deceased in that casket. And people really seem to like having their time to say goodbye, to take naps. There's a wonderful passage written by Mark Twain where he had his daughter laid out in the parlor downstairs, and he writes about coming down to look at her. He can't believe she's dead. Then he goes up and sleeps for a while and then comes back down and laments, and he's writing in between these visits with her. And it really gives you a feel for that ebb and flow and that natural grieving process of disbelief and then recognition, and then all of it in the home where you're most comfortable. So
Right.
I do see people wanting that and wanting to essentially slow down the transfer, whatever that means to them.
Right, right. And I think it's true too that if you want a home funeral, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do everything. If you're not comfortable or your family is not comfortable with body care, you can have a funeral director do body care.
Mhm.
I mean, some families wish to do that, but others maybe don't. So I think you're right. There's a whole spectrum of home funeraling
Mhm.
that's available to people. I think um, I'm concerned. Maybe I'm wrong that some people are sort of put off of the idea because they think that they'll have to do things that they aren't necessarily comfortable with the body of their loved one. And the answer to that, as we know, is no. Funeral directors can absolutely assist with that.
Yep. Or doulas, or depending on your state, home funeral guides have some rights and come in and are very, very helpful.
Yeah, they
Prior to
cannot
the funeral.
charge for that service though.
That's
They can't,
correct.
only funeral directors can charge for body care. Home funeral guides cannot charge. They can instruct the family, but
Right.
they cannot charge for it. Um,
We don't want to
so
get doulas in trouble with the funeral directors by implying that they're doing a funeral director's work. But
right,
home funeral guides in different states are, available and have more
yeah,
rights than we do here in New York.
yeah, yeah.
And
We had a question about green burial. With a green burial, will you be buried and then that same space gets used again once the person decomposes?
that's a great question. It depends on the cemetery, because at a
Hmm.
cemetery like Greenwood, they actually have green burial plots or premium plots where you bury on top with it goes down several graves.
Mm-hmm.
So usually with green burial, you want to be close to the surface of the soil and at a depth of about 4 or 5 feet. But
Okay.
at cemeteries that have double the possibility of 2 burials in one plot, you go a little deeper and then bury the second, usually the spouse, on top of the first one who's died
Okay.
some years earlier.
Sure. And there's something that's quite beautiful about that. You know, it's not just a space or a cost saving measure. Um,
Sometimes when I bury couples in graves side by side, which is it depends on the cemetery, and all Jewish cemeteries are only one grave deep. Often I will ask them, which side of the bed did mom sleep on? Because we'll put her on that side. So
mhm.
um, before we get off the subject of home funerals, I
Yeah.
wanted to show you, I did bring um, uh, some props, because when we keep someone, a deceased person, in a home for over 12 hours, generally funeral directors and home funeral guides will bring in dry ice, which
Mm,
we buy from a dry ice vendor. There are vendors all over every city serving the restaurant business and keeping cold the ice cream and the Pfizer vaccinations. Dry ice has all kinds of purposes, but I go to the dry ice dealer and have him or her cut the dry ice about the size of this book.
Okay.
So I have a brick of dry ice, and I would use gloves because dry ice will burn you.
Mm,
Um, it's so cold and it's smoking. You have to, when you bring it into the home, you have to open a window. So you put on gloves, and the vendor helps you with the dry ice. And then you have on hand just this brown grocery store paper. You wrap the ice in this. And then with a pretty white terry cloth or tea towel, wrap this brick of ice with the paper around it. The paper just keeps it, keeps the moisture.
mm,
Wrap this around it. I'm not doing it very well because I'm sitting at a desk, but, and then you wedge this brick strategically at various points of the body.
mhm,
Usually small bricks of ice on either side of the throat, and you keep the abdomen cool. And this is a way of cooling the body in the same way a Jewish firm would refrigerate a deceased person to keep
mhm,
the natural process of decomposition from occurring or slowing it down. Nothing can stop the decomposition of a deceased person's body, but you can slow it down.
mhm,
And we get people looking surprisingly natural and good this way. And there are various tricks you can learn from a teacher about how to close a deceased person's mouth. And there are lots of workshops on these subjects for people who are interested in that.
mhm.
And this is what was kind of common knowledge in most Victorian households. I mean,
Right.
everybody saw death, and a wonderful movie to see. I thought I'd never like a version of Little Women better than the original with Katharine Hepburn, but I like the Winona Ryder version where they show Beth's death and the
Mhm,
homeopathy and everything that goes around the bedside. What we're kind of doing these days in slowing down that funeral and letting people see death naturally, which seems to be what folks are craving. They don't want artifice. Um, Baby boomers have been studied, and research shows that they want authenticity more than anything else. So going back
mm,
to the funerals of the past is very appealing to them. And they want to see deceased people look naturally deceased. You know, they're ready for it. And that's what I'm finding in the families I serve.
mhm. Yeah. There was a very specific question. What percentage of the clients you serve choose home funerals?
Small, it's small. It's not a big group yet. And then
Mhm,
maybe it'll always stay small. There are a lot of people still very frightened and also
right.
exhausted. They've
Yes.
been through every stage of the cancer and seen a lot and more than they ever wished to see. And I've seen husbands almost uh angry that, you know, she's not there anymore. This is a shell, and hardly able to sit in the room for very long. And so
Mhm,
I've learned to understand people's varying reactions to death and the total understandable response. Um,
yeah.
uh, it's it's a real privilege to be in the room with people when they're making these decisions
Mhm,
and staring a loved one in the face, and really separating.
yeah. Yeah, it's powerful. It's very powerful. Um, that's why I think it's so important that people know that you can have the home funeral experience with a lot of assistance.
Mhm.
You don't have to do it all yourself. You
You
can
know
still
what?
have that.
Even if it's a hospital death, and you know, sometimes the TV's been on and there are noises in the hallway. If it's an ICU, there are all kinds of machines that are blinking and making noise. Even just having a moment at the bedside where you, in that kind of circumstance, where you take the flowers off the hospital windowsill and put them in your loved one's arms, help with the nurses' help. Sometimes you can close their eyes, smooth their hair, and fix the bed linens so that when the funeral director does arrive to the hospital to make that transfer, or when the nurses say, we really have to transfer your loved one down to the morgue, you feel like, oh my God, I did something. I didn't stand back against the wall crying. I was able to serve my mother or father or loved one and do things in a way that people look back on and find courageous.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really beautiful. We have a couple of questions about ashes. Is it illegal to spread ashes in public places?
You could get ticketed if you were flamboyantly sprinkling
Yeah.
ash.
Remember
And
that case about the man who tried to sprinkle his lover's ashes in the orchestra pit of the Met?
you
Everybody
don't
thought it
want
was
to
anthrax.
sprinkle. You don't want to sprinkle in the orchestra pit of the Met because he was arrested and was crying in the office saying, I was just doing what my loved one wanted. But I know people carefully, strategically scatter in all kinds of places that you and I might find inappropriate. A woman I knew scattered in the tree pit outside the apartment building on East 72nd Street. I think the main thing is to encourage everybody to think it out. And
Right.
I know a woman who scattered her daughter's remains in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, in a lake that she routinely swims in the summer, so that when she's swimming in this beautiful lake, she's thinking that her daughter is around her.
Yeah.
There are ways to, they're clean. Ashes are inert. Certainly the Coast Guard has regulations and
You have to get a permit, right? If you want to sprinkle at sea,
well, more importantly,
technically.
they want you 9 miles out. So hardly anyone rents a boat and goes out that far, but
Right.
that's what is requested. And I know the Botanic Garden and Central Park, I think, struggle sometimes because they probably come in Monday morning and say, oh my God, the people were here again. Cremated remains aren't especially fertile. So if you think it out and plan, that you can get a product called Let Your Love Grow, which is a fertilizer for cremated remains that
Okay.
neutralizes the pH and makes them much more fertile.
Okay.
If you're really going to do something in your own yard. And no, someday I'm going to leave this house. So maybe I should save a little bit of mom's remains or
Right.
cat remains too. People still have the same process with all this with their animals. So I just, again, want people to slow down, think it out, and make sure it makes sense for the long term.
Right.
And
Right.
there are all kinds of new options in forests, and various cemeteries are wanting people to come back to cemeteries. It's not that they want to sell you the plot. They really want you to find a home for your loved one's remains in the old-fashioned way. So
Right. There is data to
options.
suggest that that people find it very rewarding to have a place to go, like a physical location to go.
I personally think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Barbara says a friend of hers told her that ashes should never be scattered because the soul is displaced and will never be at peace.
That is in sync with what the Pope believes, or all the popes. They're not going to let go of this one because the body is still a corpus.
Sure.
Other things are changing in the Catholic Church, but the cremated remain is still a body, so everything should be intact. But increasingly, a lot of people aren't paying attention to that kind of thinking and splitting their loved one into, if there are 5 kids, there might be 5 different canisters, or one part is going to Paris. People are doing kind of interesting, creative things. And I happen to like, as your questioner might, having everything in one spot.
Yeah. Now you can have ashes made into stones that you can hold.
Really nice.
Yeah,
Those
yeah. And
stones, when you feel them, they're so smooth and it's very
mhm,
comforting. It's called
yeah.
partingstone.com.
Hmm.
Partingstone. Very successful company and a nice idea to make
Yeah,
meditative river rocks out of cremated remain.
sure, sure. What about pre-need arrangements? I think people, when they think about advanced planning, they assume that that means that they should go to a funeral director and prepay for their funeral. What are your thoughts on that? Is that still something that is quite popular, or is it even really necessary to do that?
The prepaid funeral harkens back to a day when funerals were 16, 18, $20,000 with 2 or 3 limousines for the family, a hearse, a flower car. Some of the
Hmm.
old Italian funerals used to have just a car to convey all the flowers
Yeah.
from the funeral home. And they're gorgeous things to behold because it's like
Hmm.
an open Cadillac with all kinds of flowers in the back. You hardly ever see those anymore. 12
Hmm.
years ago, I saw them occasionally. Um, but those expensive funerals were really good to get locked in and paid for in advance. If it's
Hmm.
a simple cremation, yes, you can still pay for it, but that money's not going to go to the funeral director, which is good. It goes
Hmm.
into escrow, and
Okay.
the funeral director helps you set up an account, and it does freeze the price of the cremation or the burial at today's rates.
Okay.
Everything but the cash advances. So it gets
Hmm.
to little technicalities and different columns, but for the most part, it's a smart thing to do, especially when your grandmother or grandfather is perhaps spending down and going on
Mm.
to Medicaid.
Hmm.
If you put that money, it could be their money that they put into escrow. The government doesn't see that fund, which could be $6,000 or $7,000.
Right.
It doesn't see it as an asset. So your money's protected. You can still go
Hmm.
on Medicaid, and that a lot of people rush into the funeral director saying, "I'm doing the spend down. We want her on Medicaid. We got to pay for the funeral this week." So
Uh-huh.
that happens. And yes, it's a smart thing. Um, the funeral directors are often so busy with the at-need cases, it's hard to get one to settle down long enough to
Hmm.
sit with you and plan your funeral 10, 15 years in advance.
Okay.
The big corporate firms have teams of people employed just to do the pre-arrangements. So sometimes
Right.
as an independent operator and as an innovator, I find myself, oh gosh, I don't have time to do that pre-arrangement.
Mhm.
So uh, the bigger firms have teams of folks available to you to sit down and really get it to be what you want it to be. And it's a great
Mhm.
thing to have a file, even if you don't pay in advance. It's a definite important thing to have a file in your home that everybody knows this is my death box. And I think we should have workshops for people where you take a stationery box and decorate it and then
Mm.
put all your documents in it. Of course, today with everything online, it makes no sense to have stuff sitting around in a box on paper, but certainly you can have their websites too, where you can plan your funeral,
Mhm.
house all your wishes safely on the internet, and make sure everyone in your family knows what you want. And that's the important thing. Uh,
Right.
I think where you want your money to go, or your
Mhm.
values, your letters, your recipes, all the good stuff that you help people do, Matilda, is
Yeah.
an important and neglected part of arranging your funeral.
Yeah. I think so too. We actually had a question which ties back into this, which is how often does it happen that families are divided if there have been no wishes left? That families are divided, like let's say one daughter wants a green funeral and another person wants a much more traditional service. How often does that happen, and how do you, as the funeral director, work with the families to come to some kind of consensus?
Thank God that hasn't really happened in a flamboyant way in the time I've been working. I've seen smaller arguments, and sometimes the dying person, especially with Jewish families, a lot of elderly Jewish people are, for their own reasons, wishing to be cremated, which isn't a traditional Jewish practice.
Right.
And it might upset a daughter who's married a man who is Orthodox. And I have seen Jewish families quite flummoxed and perplexed about the cremation that their elderly loved one desired. So I've seen that. But mostly it's a funeral director's role to say, you guys got to sit down and work this out. And it's really important for all of us planning our own funerals to leave clear directions as to
Right.
who's in charge. And that's called the appointment of agent to control disposition of remains. It's a long title of a document that's online that we could put into the chat, that if you don't have an obvious next of kin, or if you don't want your spouse to be the person arranging the funeral, or if they have their own issues and are unwell, you can appoint a best friend, someone in your apartment building, someone who's very devoted to you, to be your funeral agent in charge of seeing that your plans are carried out. So that document exists and is a very powerful thing, especially
Right.
with LGBTQ families, or folks who are at odds with their family of origin and have left the church or house of worship they were raised in and want a funeral quite different than the one that their next of kin might plan for them. So I do see that. And that document is important.
We've got two questions about going back to pre-need. Trina asks, what's the downside?
Of a pre-need?
Yeah.
It earns a smaller amount of interest than you could perhaps do on your own. If you're a talented person with investments, you can sock that funeral money away in your own stocks or trusts or investments, and maybe make more money with that. And then another disadvantage, I guess, I mean, you can always get the money back out as
Oh,
long
you
as
can. Okay.
long as you're not on Medicaid. When you do that spend down, that's it. It's locked. But it's still your money when you pay into escrow.
Okay.
And you're going to get statements on that money and how it's doing. You can change funeral firms. You can move in the United States. If you die on vacation in Paris, it's going to be a problem, because that fund might not be as useful over there.
Okay. Yeah, something else that I think is interesting. So prepaying for a funeral is different than prepaying for a cemetery plot or a niche at a cemetery. You can always sell your plot or your niche back to the cemetery, but never for a profit, right? So
Right.
like, so my husband and I we pre-bought niches at Greenwood. And if we wished, we could decide, that we wanted to be, buried, have a green burial someplace else. Greenwood would purchase back the niches, but only for the price that we paid.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So it really all, I mean, any kind of downside to pre-planning in either of those scenarios is that the money is tied up.
Yeah. That's correct.
Yeah. And potentially not growing.
But you can change your mind at any point. It also takes time. It's I think when in 1980, when they put the funeral rule in, here's where I sound a little bit like a funeral director. I think they overpunished the funeral director, because the funeral director can't charge a dime for sometimes the many hours that you put into sitting with someone. And that's why sometimes if you call a funeral firm, unless they have a staff of people on the pre-arrangements, you're not going to get a quick, come on in tomorrow. I'd love to see you. It's sometimes like, oh my gosh, I have to fit that in between these next 3 funerals, or the funeral director is often a very busy person.
Right.
We're less busy than we were during COVID, but gosh, the rate of death I think we're on the beginning of the death of the generation of the baby boom, and deaths will continue to rise
Yeah.
nationally in the coming decade.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. It's true.
Hmm.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. I mean, it's moving, isn't it? Because here we have all these nice people on this call, eager to learn about the funeral. It wasn't
Mhm.
that way so much when I first started. You had to really work hard to get people to sit down. I think we've all been sobered and frightened by how near death seemed to all of us during the worst of the COVID period. And then I think it's been a success that death doulas, death educators, people interested in improving America's death literacy have really succeeded in getting through
Yeah.
to folks and encouraging them to see this as not scary, as this, in a way, for parents, it's the last task of parenthood. If you're in your 60s or 70s and you have kids, it's a gift to your children to think this out for yourself,
Yeah.
discuss it with your partner, your loved ones, and then move forward in as much of the planning as you can do, still allowing them, the grievers, to make their own embellishments to your basic structure. That's what happened to my father. He had a
Mhm.
basic structure in place, and then we made the funeral so much better. But
Yeah.
if we hadn't had that structure, we wouldn't have known how to move from it.
Mhm. Yeah. Amy, where can people find you? What's your
Oh,
Instagram
I'm
handle, your website?
as most parents are yanking their children off Instagram, I'm really enjoying Instagram. I think I'm at Fitting Tribute there.
Okay.
And then I'm on Facebook. I'm proud of 2 websites that I've launched. My business website is fittingtributefunerals.com. And
Okay.
I have a website. We didn't even talk about this, but as an English major in the funeral business, I found that language, people are at a loss for what to say at a cremation or what to read at a service when they've not been affiliated with the house of worship,
Right.
or they have a mixed faith family. They might want something read that's Jewish. They might something read that is from a poet from India. And so I have a website of readings. And Katie Ann Unilisi and I, she's a funeral celebrant out west. She and I divided the end of life period into 9 stages. And
Okay.
each stage, you can put your cursor on each of those blocks, and it leads you to poetry and scripture and wonderful things for each
Oh,
of
how
those phases
beautiful.
of the end of life. That website is called The Inspired Funeral, THEinspiredfuneral.com. And I'm very proud of that website, and you'll find a lot
Yeah.
there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amy. This has been
Oh, it's very
great.
enjoyable. You're a wonderful
Yeah.
interviewer. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you,
And
House.
yes, thank you, Merchant's House. And just for everybody who is still tuned in, the next Ask will be Ask a Death Doula, and that will be on March 27th. And I think you could register now for it, Emily, right?
Yes, you can. I'd like to just give a huge thank you to Amy for being here tonight, and also
Yeah.
to you, Matilda, for planning this program series and all your hard work to make it happen. I mean, as Amy mentioned, death was such a familiar thing for families in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So in that spirit, the museum is so grateful to be able to host these discussions. So we do hope that you'll join us next month for Ask a Death Doula. If you haven't yet submitted your letter to the Adams administration to step in and help save the Merchants House, please do. I am reposting the link in the chat for your convenience.
Going
Please
there now.
stay in touch. You can follow us on social media and share our posts to tell your friends and family about the museum. The Merchants House is open to visitors on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, with options for both guided and self-guided tours. So we hope to see you soon. Tonight's program was presented free of charge, but we do hope that you will consider making a donation in support of our fight against the development next door. You can donate online at merchantshouse.org/support. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. Big thank you to Amy and Matilda for being here. And have a great night, everybody.
I'm writing my letter now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks,
Good
everybody.
night.
Bye.